Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
All right, welcome everyone to the next episode of Riskology by Infortal, where we cover the world of economics, risk, geopolitics, and really anything that can impact your business here in the US or overseas. We've got a really interesting topic to hit today. I'm joined, of course, with my co-host, Dr. Ian Oxnevad, and we've got the head of the Compliance Podcast Network with us again today, Tom Fox. Tom, great to have you back.
Thanks, Chris. I can't wait to get into our topic. I can't think of two better people to go into conspiracy.
Absolutely. Great to have you again.
With.
It's never a dull moment. I think last time we were covering the Boeing situation, so a lot of tragedy, unfortunately, but we're here to unpack the solutions. And so something hit the headlines just the other week that I'm sure everyone is familiar with now, and a really significant battlefield event, or at least I'm calling it a battlefield event, that happened over in the Middle East. And that's the attack in Lebanon on Hezbollah, which hit pagers, it hit walkie-talkies, it hit a lot of electronics out of nowhere and really caught the organization off guard. And this is a significant event. And I was trying to think of, where this would fit in the context of battlefield analysis. And I live just around the corner, actually, from the Naval Academy. And when you go through the halls, and one of the main halls, they have a series of wings with dioramas of significant battle events, heroicism, all sorts of different things. And I think this situation may rise to that level looking back 20, 30 years from now in terms of a significant development in how advanced technology is meeting what's happening on the ground as people turn towards more analog solutions. So super technical, we'll break down the issues, and then we'll look at the business impact, I think, to really think through how this is going to impact markets going forward. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to you, Tom, to sort of break down the situation, and then we'll give it to Ian.
Sure. So actually, Chris, when I saw this, the first thing I thought of course, was this is a compliance issue. And that compliance is now on the battlefield, as you suggested. And so I was incredibly fascinated by this from a supply chain perspective, from a compliance perspective, from a risk management perspective, because some of the players may have been just regular companies. Some of them may have been front companies for Israeli Secret Service or Shin Bet or others, but it really doesn't matter because the model I saw in place puts literally every U.S. company at risk from a compliance perspective. And that generally the framework of this was a Taiwanese company licensed its name. The Taiwanese company is a pager manufacturer, and it licensed its name to a Hungarian company. And the Hungarian company had the right to build and create its own pagers using this Taiwanese company's name. And the relationship kind of went along for a little bit. And then the Hungarian company said, well, we actually, we want to evolve this relationship so that our product has your name, we're not just using your name. And so that evolution was granted. We don't know how much money the Taiwanese company made, but they obviously made some money.
Yeah.
And then we moved to the operational aspect, which I found equally fascinating, which was this, Hezbollah approved supplier? Was this somehow the company, or either the front company or the Hungarian company, was able to, number one, scale an attack with pagers on multiple thousands of people. The part that I found the most incredible was they were able to deliver the pagers to the Hezbollah members. And then they were able to execute on that plan by having the pagers explode at a designated time. And so I saw a lot of compliance issues. I saw a lot of supply chain issues. It's not clear what, if any, due diligence was done by the Taiwanese company on the Hungarian company. We've seen a lot of reporting. It's all speculation at this point because There's some speculation that the Hungarian company was a Mossad front company, but they had a full background. So that if you did look into it, it appeared to be real. There was two pieces of information I found incredibly interesting, and they're a little bit at odds. One set of reporting, I think, out of Reuters said that the Taiwanese company received one payment from a bank from an undesignated Middle Eastern country. And they found that odd, but the bank in Taiwan who received the payment, they actually flagged it. And it took some time for the Taiwanese company to give documentation to their Chinese bank to get the funding through. The reporting out of Al Jazeera suggested that all payments were made from this unnamed Middle Eastern country. So I don't know which of those is right, but the Taiwanese company has acknowledged at least one payment came through the Middle East. And if you do business with a company, generally you want to be paid out of their domicile or their location. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's an offshore payment, which raises red flags. Doesn't mean you can't accept it, just means you may have to do additional due diligence on it. Or the same is true if you're paying money into, you have a contractor from Algeria and they're doing work in Dubai. You don't want to be paying them in Egypt. You want to pay them in Algeria or Dubai. So a series of potential red flags, but also I saw this as a series of lessons learned, and why I was so intrigued to visit with you guys. One, you're obviously complete full geeks like I am, so you wanted to talk about it. But two, it's exactly what you guys do at Infortal. And this seemed to me to be exactly the kind of situation where you guys could bring to bear the Infortal services to identify to a company, and I'm an American company, and they say, well, Tom, we want to use the Compliance Podcast Network, and we're going to be in Romania, and we're going to broadcast podcasts on your network. Well, you guys could go in and do a due diligence, and you could look at this and see, is this real? Are there indicia that we see or don't see that we typically would see from a company, and raise, the red flags, or at least questions that you typically would do. Further exploration or further investigation was warranted. You could do that too, but it's not just a one and done. It's a monitoring of the situation throughout the life cycle of the relationship. So if they come back to me and say, well, Tom, we want to expand that somehow, and we want to put out podcasts in Romanian under your name, that's a different risk level. So I just saw this as one, like I said, I wanted to talk about with you guys anyway. Two, it's directly into what you guys deliver as a service. So I really wanted to explore how you would think about counseling a company that is presented with an opportunity for a licensing or other business relationship, and that business relationship might expand, and how you would think through not only the background due diligence of Infortal, but also really think through the risk of that. I know I said a lot there, and it's a lot to unpack, but obviously I've been thinking about this and looking forward to this recording for a long time. So Ian, you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great plug, Tom. This sort of, I was fascinated when this attack happened, this sort of Acme, Wile E. Coyote sort of Looney Tunes attack that Israel was able to pull off on Hezbollah. I mean, from a counterterrorism standpoint, it's genius what they've done, because they managed to take out Hezbollah's middle management and the organization's communications basically instantaneously at the same time. And they're rolling up Hezbollah now, which has suddenly become the Enron of terrorist groups now, thanks to this pager attack. But going back to the supply chain issue, the Taiwanese company, if I don't know if either of you saw this, the Taiwanese company Gold Apollo, which sold the pagers, at least sold the license to this potential front company in Hungary, they also supply pagers to people like the FBI, to the Dutch government, and their main market for the pagers is foreign governments and entities, which means that even though Israel may not have any desire to attack any of these other entities, you have to see this as a massive supply chain breach that's affected God knows how many different intelligence services and governments out there in the world, and which means that none of these places did due diligence on this. And it's still a failure, regardless of what side of the politics you fall on. The fact of the matter is that when you buy something and it's got a label on it, there's a lot of other actors in the background that you don't necessarily see. If you buy a piece of electronics, the battery components, the minerals behind that came from somewhere. It was shipped by somebody. It was probably bought by a subsidiary. When you buy a Toyota, it's not suddenly that Toyota personally delivers the car to you from Japan. There's thousands of different entities and transactions that are involved in making that Toyota. And what Hezbollah didn't do, and from an operational security standpoint, they didn't really look. They just sort of bought everything on face value. And that's what's interesting about this. But the other aspect of this too is that Hezbollah was acting like any organization. A lot of people don't think about it, but terrorist groups, drug cartels, terrorist groups more so, they tend to act like nonprofits. They tend to try to minimize costs the same way that businesses do, but they have more constraints often. And what if you look at the walkie-talkie attack, which followed up the pager attack, they were buying discontinued Japanese walkie-talkies, a model that had been discontinued 10 years ago. And it's very clear that the rationale for that was that they were cheaper. And they bought them thinking that they were cheaper and discontinued, but that was still another vulnerability. And if you look at any sort of organization, you have to know who has an interest in hurting you. Whether it be a hack, whether it be a supply chain attack, whether it be a reputational attack, you have to know your risk profile. And Hezbollah's was very clear, and they probably thought, well, if we're getting them from Taiwan, there's no way that Israel would be able to penetrate that, but Israel was able to penetrate it anyway. And you have to think about it as an organization, A, who has an interest in hurting you, and B, how do you mitigate all the different compliance issues and supply chain integrity issues of everything that goes into your business? Because ultimately, that mineral, as soon as your label is slapped on it or you're using it, your organization, that's your liability, regardless of what kind of organization you're in, whether hopefully you're not engaged in terrorism. But the lesson goes across the spectrum, and it's very clear that that's what happened here. That somebody failed, and on Hezbollah's side. But it's very interesting to unpack. Chris, you probably have a lot to say about this, looking at it from like a former DHS angle.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so much to unpack here, as you'd mentioned before, Tom. But I think to hone in on the due diligence side of things, I think, as you mentioned, it's a great example of the type of services that we provide, mitigating a lot of the risks that are present in this situation, particularly when you're looking at doing business overseas, when you're looking at expanding operations. It's very easy to sort of stick with your normal game plan that works here in the US and ignore the fact that you actually need to take a deeper dive overseas and make sure you know who you're doing business with. And as you start looking at companies overseas, it's a lot more complicated. There's a lot more layers. There can be intricately woven layers of companies that you really need to dissect. And I think what stands out here is there was a lot of red flags along the way, particularly when you look at the payments. You need to have a methodology in place to where when your team spots or sees one of these red flags, particularly if you're scaling operations, you need to dive a little bit deeper. You can't make assumptions based on what your initial assessment was. And I think what we tell our clients most importantly is you cannot trust the documentation and the story that companies and individuals overseas will tell you. You have to verify. Trust but verify is really key in business, just as it is in the world of espionage. You can have a good hunch, you can have a good feeling about a company and an organization, but unless you truly verify that information, you might be flying blind.
Well, not only that, it looked like with the Taiwanese company, the Hungarian company, the person that they're interfacing with was only on like one first name basis. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but it sounds like it. And if so, that's a massive breach, especially when you think about who you're selling to. If your main customer base is foreign governments and intelligence law enforcement services, that's huge. I mean, think about if you're any sort of electronic company, or if you're a financial entity, et cetera, the vulnerabilities that you inherently offer to different segments of the population in the event of a terrorist attack, et cetera. If you're the private sector, there are different non-state actors and state actors that have an interest in co-opting your material and your products and your infrastructure in order to carry out different types of attacks. And this is like pretty glaring. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if you find pagers all over the world now in the recycler, because of this. But if it's just a first name basis, and Taiwan was selling to all these different government entities around the world, and they were really on a first name basis only with the one Hungarian company, which may or may not have been a front. I've seen stories where it turns out that they look like a legitimate Hungarian company, and they were outraged about everything. But then there may have been a front company. It's going to take some. We may never fully know. It's going to take time to unpack all this. But yeah, you need to know who you do business with from the bottom up, from your supplier, your capital, the sources of capital, all the way to your customers, because ultimately that's on you. That's your reputation. That's everything.
I would like to take that point and run with it to say it's not simply companies in an electronic or some other space that might appear to be either supplying to governments or even a vulnerable industry. I would expand it to all industries, because one may not know how one's components are used. You would hope you would, but it may be that through reverse engineering, any company in anyone's name, more importantly, and that's the cover that the Taiwanese company provided, I thought, was a credible name. And that's what concerns me the most for U.S. companies who are approached by foreign companies for some type of license agreement, that, at the end of the day, you do have to trust, you certainly have to verify, but once that name is, somebody can print it on their goods or services, you've lost control. And I just hope that this discussion about risk is a discussion that U.S. companies will start to have. There is more risk out there than you are thinking about, and at least think about this as well, so that enough sets of eyes get onto a potential opportunity going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great assessment of the situation. And as you mentioned, it's not just this industry that we're looking at here. It's really across the board that you've got to take some of these fundamental risks under consideration. And where this is difficult, and again, I keep mentioning sort of the overseas dynamic, but where it gets more complicated overseas is a lot of bad actors will use legitimate looking companies, or in some cases, actual legitimate companies that don't even know they're being utilized in certain ways. And so you can sort of indirectly get wrapped up into that if you don't do your due diligence to know, as an example, who are the other customers that the company that you're planning to do business with is dealing with? Do you feel comfortable with that? What's their track record in terms of maintaining customer relationships? Those are all the sorts of things that you really need to understand, because you can have that indirect risk exposure. Imagine, I don't know who out there has these pagers in a different context, but as you mentioned, Ian, it's going to be a lot of pagers going into the dumpster. But imagine if you had a whole team of thousands of employees all with one of these pagers, or I can't believe we're talking about pagers still, by the way, but imagine if you had thousands of employees with one of these pagers on their belt. You're going to have an entire workforce that's now freaking out. So there's a lot of unintended consequences with these situations that, again, really go back to looking at this as a fundamental set of risks that you really need to take into account.
Well, and not just, I mean, going back to Tom's point, it's not just electronics. I mean, if you're a terrorist group, if you manage to access a specific part of like the food supply, even if you weren't a direct producer, if there's some food additive that you supply to and you were able to infuse that with poison, you could have God knows how many casualties out of that. I mean, thank goodness that hasn't happened, at least not yet. But if you think about all the vulnerabilities of supply chains to competitors, whether it be the ability to elicit information by looking like a legitimate subsidiary, maybe it's not your actual partner subsidiary that's calling you up and needs another copy of certain specifications sent over that could be corporate espionage. If you're a food supplier, you have vulnerabilities with terrorism that you probably never thought about. It's endless, and it all comes down to knowing who you're doing business with, what products are actually going into your product, because it's not one thing, it's a whole bunch of different components or ingredients that go into your product, and who's your customer base, who has an interest in accessing that. Those are all things that you may not want to think about. It may seem like just additional costs, but it would not surprise me if Gold Apollo's lost a few customers after this. Because yeah, okay, Hezbollah, no one's really gonna cry about that. But all of a sudden, if you've got every other government that's been buying these pagers, dumping them because of what happened, yeah, that's gonna put them out of business very quickly. And that's your reputation. Even if you tried to rebrand, I mean, you can't recover from that.
And that's really the point I want people to understand. You articulated it exactly, Ian, that they cannot come back from this. And no one could or perhaps even should trust them going forward. And literally, they could go out of business because of this event.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end it. You know, we could go on, I think, for hours on this topic, but I think that sums it up perfectly. For those of you that do remember having pagers years ago, I think this would be a 911 situation.
Well done.